Professor Michael Northrup, and I'm here to teach you a little bit about classical oil painting. We're going to start out today with a lesson on how to do a wipeout underpainting. It's a beautiful thing. I learned it from Martha Meyer Erlebacher about 21 years ago, and I have been working with this ever since. It's a fast way to make an underpainting and a great way to help establish a beautiful, rich, deep painting when you get to those final layers of overpainting. So, as an introduction, I just want to say that this method of oil painting is about layering. It's about understanding the way that each layer of paint affects the layer underneath, and how light works as it goes in through the layers of paint and comes back out reflected to the viewer. One of the things that we're going to talk a great deal about today is the reason that we do the underpainting. When we're painting, layering paint, layer after layer with oil paint, it's important to understand that the color is affecting every color on top of it, because oil paint is basically transparent. What we are seeing happen in oil paint is when we put it on, it's pretty flat, but oil is a natural polymer, and polymers build chemical chains, which means that the substance itself physically grows as it establishes that drying. And as it dries then, and as it grows, all the little particles of color, pigment, inside the paint begin to be separated. They're pulled apart, which means you can have light pass through them, also that you can see through them. It actually takes about 120 years for the drying process to stop, and about 400 years for there to be no change at all. Most of the substantial change happens in the first 20 years. Now, what this means is that we have to change our sense of color theory. Every time you put a light color paint on top of a dark color paint, if it is transparent, we're going to cool down the entire image. In other words, everything starts to lean towards blue. Those of us that work in a classical method understand that if we want the painting to stay warm and lively over time, we have to create a process where the light that's being reflected back to the viewer is warm initially, so that that bluing effect, that cooling effect, is neutralized, and we're able to keep a much more vibrant, lively, and warm painting. If we were to paint directly on a white canvas, as the paint becomes more transparent, we're just going to see that bluing effect. And anything we do in transparent layers is going to just become too blue and too cool. The other thing we're doing by establishing initial layers is to create movement under the paint. You can probably see on this painting, this is a portrait of Margaret. This particular image has these streaks through it underneath, which I will explain how to do in a moment. But the streakiness here is not to contribute to the realism of the image. What it is, it will create a movement underneath the image as it becomes more transparent. You will never see the lines exactly, but in the period of about 8 to 10 years, I've noticed, you can already feel the undulation. In other words, for a person looking, you can see a slight variation of light and dark and warmer and cooler moving through the image. Now, that's actually what we have in nature as we look at somebody. We don't see them statically. There's always some kind of movement and warmth. And of course, when we're doing portraits, warmth means light. So quite often, we want to use as warm a material as possible. So that's the explanation of why we do this base layer, the Imprimatura, and why the next layer we're going to do is in an orange color, orange-brown, because we want to keep those warmths established. We'll completely cover all that we're doing right now. There will be none of this as it exists right now bare to the viewer. It can be done, and it was often done by people like Peter Paul Rubens, where he had a place where he would just leave this streaky paint open. I mentioned Rubens. Of course, that goes way back in art history to the 1600s, but actually this particular method was developed at the end of the 1400s in Italy. It was done a little differently in the Northern Renaissance, but eventually all the artists began to do something very similar. So if you're going to begin this kind of painting, we've got a number of materials you need to have. First of all, you need to have a canvas, and that's pretty obvious. You can also use a painting board, something that has an acrylic gesso that's sanded down to a really nice smooth texture. I'm just using a cotton duck canvas, but the truth is you get better results if you go to linen, especially portrait linen, but that's for somebody who doesn't know how to manipulate the cotton. In my experience, I like the slight texture we get of cotton. I have done absolutely smooth portraits, and if you're going for tiny details and nose hairs and eyelashes, then probably going with a panel or with portrait linen is important. If you're trying to create an expressive and a little less tight portrait, then you can use the cotton duck. I would suggest that the first many that you do be done on cotton duck because it's cheaper and it'll be easier to experiment, and if you are not happy with it, move on to the next. You will also need, of course, brush cleaner. Brush cleaner is important. I use something called Turpenoid Natural. This is what it looks like fresh. It can be used dirty. It is a citrus-based natural paint cleaner. So it doesn't have a strong odor. You can use it in an apartment building or a dorm or in a house with other people without it smelling as bad as those that are volatile, like turpentine or mineral spirits. You will need some brushes, and a number of brushes are possible. I like to use something that is nylon and gives me a good reach, like this number 12 brush. We're going to, in the beginning, be covering a whole area with paint, and so having a big brush is good. I also will be using a fan brush. Fan brushes can come in natural, like this badger hair blender, or this nylon blender, both of which are perfectly acceptable. These will not be used for applying paint. They're going to be used for smoothing the paint out. You'll also need perhaps some small brushes, small flats, small rounds, and again, synthetic is just fine. Remember in the end, though, that you're going to need to remember that the painting will only be as good as the tools you're using. At this stage, we don't need good brushes because we're going to do most of this with our finger and a cotton rag. But when you're doing the next layers, then having a good brush can be really, really, really helpful to the whole process. I quite often use this little thing. Mine's a little dirty and used. It's probably 20 years old. But this is called a wipeout tool. In fact, it's worn off of here, but if you see it in the store, it actually says W-O-T on it, meaning wipeout tool. And it was originally used for ceramics, but Martha Erlbacher, I believe, is one of the first ones to use it as for a wipeout. And it's used to remove little specks of paint, like if she had that little light part in her eye, or you can use the side and take out a whole bunch of paint like a spatula. So this is really important to have. You will need to have for this section liquid. This is Liquin Original. There's also Liquin that is for fine detail, and there's also Liquin for texture. So the original is the one I suggest, and it's the most readily available. There's also going to be a need for linseed oil. Now, linseed oil, again, you can see I buy it industrial package here because it's important for what I do as a career. You can buy a little bottle. You don't need to buy all this. And sometimes you'll find those in places like Myers and Walmart, and but you can always get online, and there are a number of online retailers like Jerry's Artorama, who you may want to look at, or Dick Blick. These are both very, very good and pretty fast at delivery. So you need this along with the liquid. Now understand that linseed oil comes in a lot of varieties. And so what you don't want is boiled linseed oil. If you go to Home Depot or Menards or Lowe's, what's going to happen is you are going to get really thinned down, boiled out linseed oil that's used for house paint, which is a significantly lower quality. You're not going to have the rich finish. It's going to go dull over time. You're also not going to have that spread in that glorious luminous ending as the whole thing begins to dry and process. So we stay away from boiled, but then we have refined linseed oil, which is the next up quality. Again, for this part of the painting, it's really, really, really fine. You don't need anything more than refined linseed oil. But later on, if you're wanting to go fatter, thicker, what you're going to do is go to things like stand oil. Now, stand oil, I don't know if you can see the viscosity in the video here, but this is more viscous, meaning it's going to be a little thicker. Stand oil is just linseed oil that's taken up to a temperature and held there for quite a while. And what that does is thicken it and start the hardening process before you even move into it. So it's a very good oil for making the paint dry faster, but it's quite significantly more expensive than the refined linseed oil. Also note that you can also get things like sun-thickened linseed oil, which for a final layer might be great, but it's not necessary right now. All of those oils are a possibility, but basically in the end, we're just going to make one combination and use it with one color. You will also need a bunch of cotton rags. These are cut up t-shirts, and they should be cut up into sections about this big. Otherwise, when we're wiping out, your paint that you've wiped out will hang down your shirt and get on the front of you, get on your jeans, whatever. So we try to make them somewhat small so that we can use them up and throw them away. As a safety note, remember you should probably have some bags around, some garbage bags that you can put these in and tie it shut. If you're using anything other than Turpenoid Natural. If you're using mineral spirits, if you're using turpentine, that's volatile, and it's letting off the fumes, which are explosive, right, or combustive. And then we have these rags that also have linseed oil. Now, I told you about the polymer chains that get built. If you know chemistry, you probably have already guessed that as the polymer chains are building, it actually releases heat. If you have enough air and you have the heat from the linseed oil and the volatile fumes of the turpentine, what's going to happen is a fire. It's spontaneous combustion. And so we need to be careful. Like I said, I don't use that for that purpose. I'm a little bit of a fire phobe here. And so I make sure that I'm using a non-flammable kind of thinner. But if you're not able to find it or able to do that, always take the used rags, squeeze all the air out, and then you can throw them safely into a dumpster without a risk of fire, because they have to have air in order to work. So we get all of those things together. I also like to have a funnel, kitchen funnel that I can use to mix my medium. I actually have some medium already mixed, but I think right now, just for the sake of showing you, we're going to mix the medium when we get there. And I don't know if I mentioned the all-purpose pencil. When you're drawing, you cannot use a regular graphite pencil. Let me rephrase that. You can, but it's likely to smear. So if you do not have an all-purpose pencil, you can get at any art store some varnish. And what you can do is just do your drawing and then a light coat of varnish over it, let it dry before you move on to this next stage I'm going to describe. So drawing is the first thing. If we have like a Stabilo all-purpose pencil, which is their stock number 8008, that is a wonderful pencil because it's made for marking on glass, it's made for marking on wood, anything like that. But it's oil soluble, meaning that I can write on a glass and water won't take my graphite off. However, oil will. No, I'm sorry. I should have said that the other way around. I'm sorry. So if I draw on a glass, the water will take it off, but oil will not. That's what I meant to say. So scratch that last little bit. So we use this all-purpose pencil because when I go over it with oil, it won't smear. If I use graphite, just regular graphite, water won't get off. Oil will. So that's why I was backwards here for just a second, what I was describing. A regular graphite pencil will smear when I'm putting oil over it. So as I just said, you can use the varnish to seal it in, or even a fixative. You can use like a pastel fixative to make it less likely to smear when we're wiping over it. Because we're actually going to be scrubbing on this drawing when we're first going through it. Now, when you draw this on the canvas, you want to draw it open. In other words, almost like a paint by number. This is going to make it easier for you. Once you establish your outlines and erase any extraneous marks, which by the way is not real easy with an all-purpose pencil, so you probably can guess already that you're going to have to just get a little water and a cloth, and you can get that off if it's not erasing well. You make sure that, like here, I've just marked the shadows around her eye because that's going to be really helpful. The shadow on this, and I'm drawing, you can see the same things on the drawing. Everything that's here, I'm just trying to make this line that's continuous. To me, that's very interesting. So I'm looking for those kind of structures that also kind of nail the face. As I'm standing here, I just quickly put position of lips. Obviously, I have the lips drawn wrong. I can see it here, but as long as I have the position, I'm most worried about the finding my key points, like the eyes, nose, and mouth. That's going to really help. So I draw it open like that. Then I take this color, this yellow ochre or gold ochre. In this case, I used a gold ochre, which is by Gamblin oil paint. But any yellow ochre or gold ochre will work. Yellow ochre is going to be greener, so it's not quite as warm. If the final result of what we're showing you on the video is too hot for you, then a yellow ochre is a better example. So I put some of this out on my palette, and then I make a pile of the liquid that I bought, and that's all I use. And I don't pre-mix it. I'm just going to go back and forth between a little yellow ochre, a little liquid, and streak. Little yellow ochre, a little liquid, and streak. Okay? And so it should look kind of like wood grain in the end. I have some students who've gone in X marks. There are all different ways to make this work. You just want movement. Now my rule is I go with the light. So in this particular image, you can see the light is coming on her face from this direction. And this is the shadow part. There's reflected light over here, but this is the brightest side. So what I did is I brought the streaks from the side of the light. So when the painting is mature, when it's hardened, what you're going to get is just a little bit of a feeling of rays of light coming across the light side of her body. And that should be gorgeous. And that's really what we're trying to do, is accentuate that movement. So you do that until the end. Try to fill in all the little interstices of the canvas. Make sure there's no little white spots. Those are called holidays. I actually left some on purpose on this one, not because it's actually not going to make a bit of difference to the final painting, but it'll be smoother for somebody who's not been working with this. I know how dark this area is, so I chose this for the demonstration part. But right here are places where the white of the canvas is still showing through. You'll see if you follow this through to the end, it's not going to be visible a bit. But when it's possible for you, especially in the beginning, try to not go with these little areas here where the white's showing through. That's, like I said, again, I knew this was going to be used as both a teaching piece and a portrait from the very beginning. Now, please understand that this background is not usually black at this time. Her background is actually going to be kind of pastel colors. They're going to play off this violet and the rose color that's in the barnwood where the photo was actually taken because it was at a significant event. But we're going to do it just as loose color. So this is a do as I say, not as I do moment. I would never normally put black. And this is actually a blue black, it's not pure black, but I put that on to really make this obvious. The background's going to be pretty dark, so it's actually not going to hurt a bit. I just want to say I would normally do this all with just very, very, very dark burnt sienna, the next color paint we're going to use. But I wanted this dry, and I also wanted it to clearly define the area we're working with. And more than anything right now, the black is going to help you see what I'm doing and where I'm working. So that was that purpose. Make sure if you have any questions as I go through this, you can jot them down. You can always email me at mnorthrup@glenoaks.edu, and that can be a little bit of a fast way usually of getting a hold of me, and I can get back and answer your question. So now I think we're about ready to do the underpainting.